Morning all. I think we're ready to rock, aren't we? And we do have a camera on us, so everything is on the record. Tread carefully. Welcome to this particular session. The title of the session, Protectionism as a Source of Global Instability. Now, you may or may not have realized during the 1990s and most of the first decade of this century that you were actually living through the golden era for free trade. And ever since then, it's somewhat gone pop. We've obviously had quite a lot of publicity recently about protectionism, but it isn't entirely a new thing. If you look at the bald statistics of this, in 2009, about 20% of the output of G20 countries was subject to some sort of tariff. By 2017, that had gone up to 50%. So this is obviously before we start taking into account things like the current president of the United States, what's happening with the United Kingdom and the European Union, and so on. So this is something which has been going on for more than a decade now. We do need to talk about Donald J. Trump. Of course we do. Because, well, I'll get onto that tweet in a second, but that 50% figure in 2017 doesn't include the tit-for-tat tariffs, which were imposed last year after the US started putting up its tariffs on everything from washing machines to steel, whether it was China, the European Union. That happened last year. We've got more tariffs coming in this year. So you can imagine what the figures are going to be like. Donald Trump, meanwhile, is now hereby decreeing things on Twitter. Our great American companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China. It's great, isn't it? Government by social media. I think we can try something similar on this panel. So to introduce everybody, I would like to find out what everybody on this panel would like at the start of this panel to hereby order. So in my case, I'm Guy Delaunay. My day job is a foreign correspondent for the BBC and for Monocle. And I hereby order David Cameron to get out of his shed and face the music. And I think we should go down the panel and see what everybody would like to hereby order. Moimir, I'm going to start with you. Dr. Moimir Mrak is the professor of the School of Economics and Business at the University of Ljubljana. What would you like to hereby order? And you can turn your microphone on, I think.
Well, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I think, these trade tensions are really now very, very high, very topical issue. But on the other side, I think this what's going on, precisely on the lines what you're saying, it's something which is rather a symptom of things which are going on beyond the things for some time. And I think if we would concentrate too much exclusively on trade, then of course we might miss some other very important things bringing to this issue. Let me say a few, just two things, I know 30 seconds.
Before we get on to the 30-second bit, Moimir, just a one-liner, we'll come back for the 30 seconds in a moment, but you're hereby ordering what?
Well, I am basically ordering that the trade tension should be really discussed in the context of the broader diseases of the global economy which you are witnessing after the crisis.
Thank you very much. And we'll move on to Lawrence, who's sitting next to you. Lawrence Aginsam is the CEO of the Ghana Export-Import Bank. What would you like to hereby order, Lawrence?
I hereby order the European Union to take the mantle of leadership in the world stage.
Thank you. And we'll doubtless hear more about that from Sandra. Moving down the line to Ulrik Knudsen, the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD.
The bad news is that there's a big risk that recession is coming. The good news is that this is actually the recession we can avoid, and trade policy plays a big part in that.
And you're hereby ordering?
I'm not ordering anything. I'm just a civil servant at the OECD, and the US is one of our biggest and most valued members. So,
Spoken like a true diplomat. Dr. Rem Korteweg is the Senior Research Fellow at the Klingendael Institute in the Netherlands. And you are hereby ordering what, Rem?
Thank you, Guy. I hereby order that national security is no longer used as a justification to impose tariffs.
And we'll see if there's a snappy comeback from the European Union side of things. Sandra Galina is the Deputy Director General, DG Trade at the European Commission.
Yes, I hereby order that you can only tweet with your toes.
I think that's something we can all get behind. Do we agree? And last but not least, Timothy Yiend is the Principal Advisor to the DG and Chief of Cabinet at the World Trade Organization. Oh, you need your mic. I hereby order you to turn on your mic.
I hereby have my mic on, and I think my hope is that countries will work together on the big issues facing us, and that, of course, includes global trade. So,
well, what I wanted everyone to start off with, apart from hereby ordering things and getting into the spirit of being Donald J. Trump, I wanted everybody to lay out a thought or two in 30 seconds just to kick us off. So let's go down the line, starting with you, Moimir.
Well, to continuing what I started to say is that it's really the trade is part of the broader issues. I think they are really underlining certain things which are going on after the crisis. Here I would basically say that we were putting a lot of efforts on the monetary policy after the crisis to save the growth. In my view, that has really helped us in overcoming this, but on the other side, it has created a lot of problems, particularly related to the inclusive growth. We are now seeing that if the central banks will be asked again to do these things, they will end up in basically on the currency wars, which is probably or could be the next step from the trade disruptions.
Thank you. Lawrence, your 30 seconds, please.
Thank you very much. International trade is going through a turmoil at this point in time because of the fight between US and China. And Guy, I must tell you this. 2 years ago, I found myself in a conference in the US Exim conference in US. And the topic for discussion was the China challenge. At the point in time, the US has realized that China is now going to lead in the global stage. And therefore, for some of us, we are not surprised that Donald Trump is now ordering China to become a threat or an enemy. It's because the world doesn't understand the strategy that China has prosecuted over the years. When China decided to go for exports, they set up 3 institutions: the China Exim, the China Development Bank, and Sinosure. These were the 3-pronged approach that China used to be able to take the world stage in terms of trade, while else others were sleeping. But again, as you rightly said, we have been there before. In 1930, the Great Depression. So after that, the world was able to come back to free trade. And there was a proliferation of free trade. Although this may be a short-term strategy, I know that at the end of the day, multilateralism, rule-based organization like WTO, in the long term, will win the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence. Let's move on to Ulrich, your first thought.
well, I think what is sometimes overlooked, both among economists, but perhaps especially among politicians, is that protectionism is basically a tax on the consumer. Protectionism is often even a repressive or regressive tax on the consumer when it comes to food and clothing. When the consumer pays, it actually means that it's a higher percentage of the income that is paid to tariffs by the poorest. So it's not only a tax on the consumer, of course, it's then also a tax on the voter. And that would be the transmission from the economic analysis to the political analysis, that we should really not fear free trade. We should only fear others' fear of free trade. And then, of course, we need to get out of this conundrum, and the only way to get out of it is to challenge or to address some of the redistributional effects of it. And here I think it is important for politicians to explain that this is done through social policies, educational policies, redistributional policies at home, not abroad, where free trade is making the cake bigger for everyone.
Thank you. Rem?
Yeah, thank you very much. I come at the topic of trade from a foreign policy perspective, and what I see worries me. Not just the fact, what I just mentioned, that national security is increasingly used as an instrument of justification for imposing tariffs, but trade deficits are now seen as weapons deployed by others to undermine countries on trade. We see the weaponization of currency. We see institutions that underpin rules-based trade being threatened in its functioning. We see blacklisting of companies, making it impossible to access markets, and we see retaliatory lists being drawn up, particularly in the IT sectors. And what I worry about is that when we look to the future of globalization, that there is a process of decoupling taking place in a context of growing geopolitical tensions. And these geopolitical tensions, this geopolitical competition, is becoming primarily viewed through the trade lens. This is, of course, US-China, but Europe is also caught up in this mix. And that, from a foreign policy perspective, deeply worries me.
Okay, Rem's worried. How do you feel, Sandra?
Strange. We are sitting next, but we didn't arrange this. So first of all, thank you to all of you for coming to this panel. I think it's very appreciated from all of us to see you here attentively listening, but we want questions afterwards. So please don't just absorb, reflect and propose. My point is that I want to sound a bell of alarm, given that I'm a numbers person, at least in this room. This is the largest trade conflict we are witnessing for a long time. Guy was right in basically pointing at routes which stretch beyond what is currently on the headlines in newspapers. If I were to give you a proportion, at the moment all trade from US to China is hit by higher tariffs, on average 24.5, 24.7, depending on the calculations. And at the moment, 1/3 of US trade into China is hit with tariffs of 25%. For specialists, these numbers of average tariffs are very telling. Things that China excluded are aviation, aircraft, or technological stuff. That is not included in the Chinese sanctions. I want to make you aware that the war started very, very, I would say, small, with only 10 billion at the beginning of January last year, and it escalated quite quickly. We had, first the 10 billion were against all countries. It was a multi-country thing done by the US. You remember the washing machines from Korea got caught too. Then, we started with much bigger amounts, multi-country, but this is the steel, steel and aluminium. And this hit us all. We in Europe replied with a safeguard. Then we had China-only sanctions from the US. And here we go with the big numbers. And I spare you all the numbers, but I tell you, yesterday I was reading yet another slot of predictions of the impact on world GDP. World GDP is more or less 97, 98 trillion. And you will be hit by 0.5 or 0.6, depending on calculations. So it's 185 billion of good domestic production that goes down the drain. Now, crisis brings things to a head because you were right. The issue that puzzles me as a trade specialist is that for the first time I have to deal with security. Sorry, guys, I have no idea about this topic. So the issue is also that we are now in the fragmented panorama of the EU I would say, construct, because trade is one thing, foreign policy is another, competencies are different. We have like sliding doors, and you know, it's very difficult for us in trade to touch this security thing. So, as I said, with a crisis, things happen, and perhaps we will have a discussion which will also imply an internal review of what we do in the EU. I take that perspective. We can talk also of China, US, but I say, as EU, we need to have better tools to deal with this type of protectionism. This is new protectionism, big protectionism, and I would say popular protectionism. Don't forget it's very popular.
Thank you. Tim, we've all heard in Britain how great WTO rules are. Give us 30 seconds. And don't forget your mic.
Thanks. Yeah, look, I wanted to start with a bit of a historical reflection, if I could. History is one of my great passions, and I think that it's interesting that I think 75 years ago, last month, the Bretton Woods conference started, and as I'm sure many of you know, the reasons for that conference were, you know, after a few decades of economic chaos, World War, and the depression of the 20s and 30s, and what made the downturn all the worse was that everyone turned in, everyone raised tariffs, beggar thy neighbour, tit for tat. Does that sound familiar in the current environment? So out of the Bretton Woods conference, the global economic order that is coming in for a lot of criticism now was established, and the WTO, or its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was part of that. So I would argue in the current environment that we're in, raising trade barriers and turning inwards is not the answer to our problems. But we do have problems, and I work at the WTO, and I know that we have many problems at the WTO that we need to fix. But I would like to think, and it comes back to my introductory order, sort of that we could somehow re-establish a dialogue and cooperation aimed at strengthening the global trading system, strengthening the WTO, so it's fit for purpose and able to deal and respond with the challenges that we have there. And there is some hope in this regard. I can get into that a bit later on, but I think that they're the key issues I'll put out there to start with.
If we're looking at this not as something which has just happened, but something which has its roots in 2008, then surely this is a reaction to free trade, to globalization, the 1990s. I mean, you can almost draw a straight line from Francis Fukuyama's End of History through to the crisis of 2008, through to where we are now, with little stopping off points along the way. Yet the world only just now seems to be waking up to the fact that we have got a serious and escalating issue with protectionism. Why did it fly under the radar for so long? I'd be interested in anybody's view. First to the mic wins. You win, Ulrich.
It's interesting. You talk, Sandra, about protectionism being popular, and you talk about protectionism on the rise now. But this is really an industrialized country phenomenon. There is absolutely, almost no backlash against globalization when we look at Africa, when we look at Latin America, and when we look at Asia. So it's pretty interesting that the countries who have actually benefited the most from the open global trading system, namely Europe, US, and lately also China, they are the ones who are now somehow turning against it. But we should not, I think, forget that this is not a global phenomenon in the sense that the developing countries are perhaps turning away from protectionism more now than any other time in their development, and they're seeing also growth rates, nice growth rates coming out of that. So I think it has to do with uncertainty in Europe and in America, uncertainty about globalization, about digitalization, and I think there is a real risk that we will see a splintering, that we will see different systems. And I agree with you, Rem, that this is also something we have to analyze through a geopolitical lens. I think in the United States, many people are not asking any longer the question, how can we avoid a Cold War between US and China? They're now asking, how can we win it? It's a fact. There already is a Cold War. And this is not only taking place now in the trade arena, also in the technological arena. And we are being given different answers when we ask around the world, for example, who owns data? Data also has a lot to do with trade. We're discussing e-commerce in the WTO at the moment, although it's only a plurilateral trading negotiation. But if you ask in the US, they would say that, well, the market and the companies own our data. If you ask in Europe, we would say, well, it's the individual, it's the consumer owning the data. In China, they would probably say it's the state or the party. And in developing countries, they would say, well, what data? We don't really have them gathered in any one particular place. So there is already this splintering. There is already various systems emerging when it comes to the other part of the Cold War, namely the data. And we could fear that something similar will happen in the trade scene. I hope we can avoid it.
Sandra and Moimir both want to say something, but I could see Lawrence smiling during the first part of your answer, Ulrich, and it would be rude of me not to ask you, Lawrence, what is the feeling then in Ghana? Does that match what Ulrich was saying?
From you that we didn't see it coming. I mean, if you watch Donald Trump in his campaign when he was talking about his foreign policy and the fact that he was going to be a deal breaker, he's come to the table without any deal being done. He's come to the table to review NAFTA and all the things that, and in all of this, some of us saw it coming because he saw that going around campaigning, most of the jobs have been lost in America and finding itself in China because of economies of skills, because of cheap labor, and all the things that goes with it. And therefore, to reverse it is to make sure that he attacks China by way of trade, to make sure that he reverses and creates some jobs in his country. So for some of us, it is not strange to us that this is happening. And again, as Professor Sachs said yesterday, Jeffrey Sachs said yesterday, I would say that this is just one-off. The world should not panic. Europe should not panic. Who knows 2020 what will happen in the American election.
But is the experience in Ghana, as far as you're concerned, one that people don't have a problem with globalization? They're happy with the idea of free trade and want to be part of it, and the improved standards of living which it is supposed to bring?
As you may know, Africa has always been at the other end of the story. We only have about 6% of the world trade. And that is why here now, just about last month, now we have the Continental Free Trade that has come on board. And Africa is now talking about Agenda 2063. In Agenda 2063, Africa is hoping to harmonize this market, have a global market of a population of about 1.2 billion. And for us, we think the tables will turn because we have all the natural resources. Africa is going to have the youthful population in the next decade or two. And therefore, there will be the reverse of migration. There will be the reverse of brain drain. I am a student of UK. I did my master's in Leicester, and now I'm managing a government bank in Ghana, which is what Korea did, which is what Japan did, and which is what China did. So there will come to a time, and it's already happening. Nobody is checking the reverse of people who have acquired knowledge and expertise and who are going back from Britain and from America. We all hear about migration and immigration. At the core of some of these things, the discomfort is that it's immigration that has also fueled some of these things that are happening, the populist. And these are things that we should be bold to talk about it. The underlying current of some of these issues are immigration. Pure and simple.
Moime, you had your hand up just before as well.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to, because you were basically saying, globalization, in a way, in developed countries, were kind of, at least I understood you the way, they were basically getting a lot through this. I think, it's obviously that the globalization has also caused certain things internally within the countries. You see practically in all, or at least a large number of developed countries, that you have this polarization, particularly this middle class, there was this relocation of the industries. So, this, with the time, you had then this transformation to the political issues, populism. We see this in Europe very clearly. And, if we go back to Trump as a kind of the slogan, America first, bringing job back. That was kind of my understanding of, and of course, if you want to bring this job back, looking at the current account, let's close this and the jobs will come back. Of course, I think the tariffs, I'm not a trade specialist, but I think the tariffs in the context of the, let's say, we are very often referring to the 1930s, there the exports and the imports was really exports and imports. But now you have a lot of reallocation of industries, so basically through the tariff to China, you have a lot of American companies there, which is basically, shooting in your leg. So the globalization has really put, I would say, this diversification, I would say inequality. And I think the problem which I see with the globalization, that it was really not accompanied with this inclusiveness in terms of the economic growth. And I'm coming back again to the monetary policy. Right? If you remember how we cured globally the last crisis, you have basically three things. One thing was monetary. On the fiscal side, differently. In Europe, we had already at that time a bit strange situation. And the third thing, very important from our perspective, is that in terms of the trade protectionism, if I am not mistaken, one of the first things of the G20 in November 2008 was, don't go towards the protectionism. Today, this kind of a discussion, I think we have in this respect one instrument less available if the things will go down in terms of the economic growth, not to say crisis of that type.
Sandra, you have a bit more to react to now.
Well, in part, I do agree with what has been said, especially Lawrence. And, in a sense, the only place where I want to make you aware of is that, okay, we are here in a big event, globalization, or everybody wants to speak globalization, Trump and all, but I will bring you to another place which is closer to what Tim was saying. It's not that we didn't see it coming. We had an issue, and the issue was that we had a rules-based system. Basically, the depository of that rules-based system for trade was WTO. We were having not too dysfunctional WTO, where we would have cases brought there. The cases would be won or lost, more or less. Everybody felt a sense of justice. The issue starts to grow when there is a dimension which we can't seize, which is the difference within the different countries. And I think we need to be very careful about labeling US or China or even EU or Africa and putting them into boxes. China has lived up to all its WTO commitments, and at the end of the day, we were discovering that this may not be enough, because in fact the commitments were shaped, in particular for one area which is called subsidies, in a way that was very difficult for somehow the same level playing field to be had between the various players. Level playing field, this is the key word, not globalization or other stuff. So an African has to be able to compete, and there was lots of demagoguery on this. millions of people have been lifted out of poverty through trade, that I admit, but how, at which price, consumers in Europe are becoming aware of different things which are not necessarily strictly trade, but more fair trade. So, let me say, voters have expectations that need to be fulfilled. For us, in trade, we saw that subsidies were a growing problem. For many years, we were exposed to the DDA in the discussion of agricultural subsidies, and here I know that with Africa we had lots of discussions about, the dairy, our subsidies. So we can say that in seasons, we have been all on the spot for this subsidies thing. And we thought that the rule book was enough, but apparently it's not enough, because it doesn't capture elements that can provoke a level playing field. And then, you have different choices which are political, so I respect the political choice of the US to go for a certain reaction. It's their choice. EU will show leadership in trying to certainly uphold the multilateral system. I hope Lawrence is a prophet and that the multilateral system in the end will carry the day. But it's not easy times, because when I was saying that certain things are popular, is that even if I'm a bureaucrat lost in an opaque, I would say, office in Brussels, I can sense that around me, people are looking at what Trump is doing. And some industries even, have decided to sever their operations. They have become totally American, especially in the aluminium sector. And they say they are profitable in the US right now, maybe short term, but they are profitable, whilst they are at zero, break even now in Europe, and they will go, and I would say in a different category if we don't stop what is happening. And it's not just the tariffs, is that there is a broader context. Migration is one issue, but there is also a need for a transition towards a different, more sustainable pattern of economy, and this is expensive. If we see, yesterday I was shocked, if the water rises by 1 meter, the expenses, especially in your country or in other countries of Europe on the Atlantic, is going to be huge, monumental. We're talking about trillions here. So, let me say, it seems to me we are all zooming into this globalization. No, let's go for the fundamentals. Historically, protectionism is bad. Historically, globalization has been rather good, and it's a natural phenomenon. On the other hand, we're talking here about other dimensions. Can we have everybody play with the same rules? That's what I would like to.
We'll get you in a sec, Rem, but I just want to give Tim the chance, as the WTO was cited there, to come back on that.
Yeah, sure. No, look, I'd agree with a lot of the comments that have been made, but again, introducing a slightly longer-term sort of perspective in some of this. Protectionism, we've been talking about the last couple of years, where there's been a particular spotlight put on trade, or we've been saying since 2008. But protection, I've been doing trade and trade negotiations and trade policy for a long time, and protectionism has always been there in certain certain quarters. And in fact, you have to be very careful with the word protectionism, because a lot of people would see they are introducing legitimate measures, and in fact you are able to do that under WTO rules. There are you sign up to certain commitments, and as long as you stay within those commitments, you can raise your tariffs or you can have subsidies, etc. So it's a very loaded term, and I think you need to keep some perspective on that. But I think that what's under challenge at the moment is that we have for many years had a set of rules that have helped to provide stability and certainty, and those rules are embodied in the agreements of the WTO. I think that we need to recognise that there are problems, and some of those problems have been highlighted by current tensions. There are problems with some of the rules of the organisation. Many members are saying that they really need to be updated, and the reality is that they haven't been updated apart from a quite significant agreement on trade facilitation in 2013. Apart from that, and some other smaller agreements, there hasn't been any updating of those rules for over 20 years, and it is, and the world's, you can imagine 20 years ago, electronic commerce, the digital, the internet, mobile phones, the global trading system is not, and value chains, exactly. It's not fit for purpose in my view, and certainly part of what we have been trying to do at the WTO is to encourage a discussion amongst WTO members, because it's the members that have to carry this discussion forward to update those rules. But it's not easy, and it gets back to this question of protectionism or trade restrictions, or needing to protect my infant industries, or ensuring there's local production in my country. All of these things, some people would say protectionism, others would say they're legitimate policy purposes. But it gets back to that there is value in setting standards globally. They may not be the highest standards, and you can always go higher if you want to, which is what happens in a lot of bilateral negotiations. They build from WTO rules, but we need those rules. We need to update them, and we also need to be able to enforce those rules. And as I think, again, I'm sure many of you are aware, there are some real challenges for the WTO's dispute settlement system at the current time. And certainly I would argue we need to fix that part of our architecture. Is absolutely critical to enforcing those rules and providing the stability and certainty that helps us continue to grow and strengthen the global economy.
Thank you, Tim. Rem, I can tell you've been winding up, so let's have it.
No, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, but that's not interesting.
Oh no, come on, disagree.
No. See, let me add in two points which I think we haven't talked about so far. One is the West has a China problem. And when China was brought into the WTO, there was a general expectation that China would gradually become to look more like European or US economies and political systems, to be honest. And that hasn't happened. In fact, what we've seen is that given the size of China, China's been able to develop through an alternative model, and is now presenting an alternative model. And that model is very much based on giving state subsidy to sectors that can then outcompete either European or US peer firms. There's been massive transfer of wealth and IP towards China through the simple logic of the way that the international trade system functions. That's not bad, but it does raise questions whether the WTO rules are up to date and whether they're able to be enforced. And what we see happening is that there's actually an agreement between Europe and the United States about this problem, that one of the difficulties with updating the WTO system is that the rules aren't able to get China to conform to what the rules are or to enforce them. And then that's the point where Europe and the US start to disagree. Because Europe says, we need to follow the multilateral route, don't throw away the baby with the bathwater, let's work through the WTO system, let's try to talk with the Chinese about updating the system. And the Americans have said, well, frankly, we're big enough and we've had it, and that's when you get Trump. And I think we need to recognize that that ultimately this is a common interest between the Americans and the Europeans, and the rest of the world for that matter, to ensure that an economy the size of China operates according to rules that we set together with China as well. That's my first point. Secondly is, another one of my concerns is that Trump is not a passing phenomenon. And regardless of what happens in the 2020 elections, I think what he's shown to future generations of American political leaders, whoever comes after Trump, will use tariffs, will try to take the fight to China, and will be, I think, inspired by some of the results that Trump has so far been able to achieve, which is to use the economic muscle of the United States to bully around smaller trading partners. I mean, I'm deliberately phrasing it as sort of black and white to drive home the point. The fact is that through the bullying practices of the Trump administration, there has been a renegotiation of NAFTA. There now is a discussion in the context of the WTO of moving reform forward, which is a point that the Americans like to raise particularly. And they say WTO reform wasn't really moving forward up until the moment when Trump started to put the axe to the WTO tree. And that type of behavior fits with an economy the size of the United States, which is also seeing that in the future, it's not going to be as large as it is right now, simply through the distribution of wealth and economic production as a function of globalization. So now is the American moment to flex its economic muscles if it's not going to be overtaken by China at a certain point. So this is, I think, important to recognize that, one, that we have a China problem, and two, that Trump is a logical product of where the United States now finds itself in the global economic system.
Thank you. I want to, first of all, get this microphone working, and we have. Terrific. The other thing I need to check is, have we got audio from this laptop? Did you know, by the way, that may you live in interesting times? It's often cited as a Chinese curse. It was, in fact, invented by a British politician called Austen Chamberlain, who was the brother of Neville Chamberlain. So, and I think, bearing in mind the times that my country is living through at the moment, that's entirely opposite. Is everybody sick of looking at Donald J. Trump? Tough luck, because we have a bit more. Let's see what we can do here. A little bit of video. Hopefully the sound works.
Who's your biggest competitor, your biggest foe globally right now?
Well, I think we have a lot of foes. I think the European Union is a foe, what they do to us in trade. Now, you wouldn't think of the European Union, but they're a foe. Russia's a foe in certain respects. China's a foe economically, certainly. They're a foe. But that doesn't mean they're bad. It doesn't mean anything. It means that they're competitors. They want to do well, and we want to do well. And we're starting to do well. You see what's going on. We have the best employment numbers probably that we've ever had. Black unemployment is the lowest level in history. Hispanic unemployment, the lowest level in history, Jeff. Women unemployment, lowest in 66 years. Our numbers are great. Our GDP numbers are far greater than what they thought.
A lot of people might be surprised to hear you list the EU as a foe before China and Russia.
No, I look at them all. Look, EU is very difficult. I want to tell you, maybe the thing that's most difficult, don't forget, both my parents were born in EU sectors, okay? I mean, my mother was Scotland, my father was Germany, and, you know, I love those countries. I respect the leaders of those countries, but in a trade sense, they've really taken advantage of us, and many of those countries are in NATO, and they weren't paying their bills.
There we have it. We don't want any more. No, no, no. No, thank you. I think that's quite enough for the minute, isn't it? We are talking about protectionism as a source of instability in the world. So I do want to ask you, first of all, Sandra, how problematic is it for that sort of language of the European Union, in this case, being a foe, but he also mentioned China as well. How problematic is it for that sort of language to be invoked when we're talking about trade, and what could be the possible consequences?
Now, I've been in this sort of area of work for over 20 years now, starting as a small expert of rules of origin and going, you know, towards other realms. I had lots of Africa in my portfolio, I had lots of WTO, and now I have the whole of the, I would say, a side of DG Trade, which is basically the safeguards, the WTO, I would say many, many bits and pieces that fit this event. May I say one thing? The language is problematic for me. I was just saying to Tim that I will never be able to have bad words about partners such as US or China, because I have worked in WTO for 12 years and in the WTO as an EU representative. And I had fantastic relationship personally. I thought that we were in sync, more or less. And what is really disturbing for me now is that a country with which we have a commonality of views, because let me say, this issue of the subsidies is really crucial. And, you know, it was also, as I may recall for all of you, not totally new. We had a provision, I don't want to bore you with technicalities, which is Article 6, well, paragraph 1, of the agreement on subsidies, which basically was attacking the sort of subsidies that bother us. It was at the request of the EU that article was put there in that agreement. But the US, this is the irony, the US said, watch, we'll let you put it. But at the end of the day, this was Marrakesh, if it ain't used by 99, it dies. Nobody used that before 2000 because, you know, we were all in a buoyant state. We were having, I would say, this prospect of constant growth ahead of us. So the article died. Now, even resurrecting that article is difficult because, may I say, we also have, as Europeans, our own approach to subsidies, which is no longer what it was. And, you know, it's because of the inequalities and the unfairness. And, you know, sometimes you accept a restructuring plan from an industry, even if you know that, you know, it will require, but, you know, votes and social priorities are important. So, I mean, let me say, trade cannot be the steamroller of all these priorities in countries. So for me, the language is shocking. EU is a foe. EU, you know, basically has a huge surplus with the US. Okay, all these things we can discuss. But the fundamental issue is that overall, we all benefit from these exchanges. And this is, you know, this is why I'm shocked by this language. So now let me come to the real problem this language poses for us, very concrete one. We're trying to work with the US on different files, and imagine that we want to work with China on different files, and we are trying to build this bridge and to try to have, I would say, communication under the aegis of the WTO, because we like multilateralism, we adore multilateralism, also because of issues of competence that we can go into. So for us, rules-based system is what makes Europe prosper. On the other hand, you know, it's very difficult for a USTR colleague now to come with a forthcoming attitude on issues that concern China, because, you know, we are, as Europe, the foes too. And I cannot tell you how personally disturbing this is, but it is also concretely problematic, because then it's for us almost impossible to get people to sit in the same room, to have EU, US, China. We now have what we call the trilateral with Japan, but, you know, it's Japan, US, EU trying to work out something on subsidies. But my personal view is that you need the Chinese involvement upfront if you want to be successful. It's very seldom the case that you are out of the room, somebody comes and says, we prepared this cake for you, eat it. Not so sure it works. So from my point of view, we will exert leadership. We will try to be, I would say, as optimistic as Ulrich was. I am less optimistic when it comes to avoiding the crisis, because votes are important. and this type of language works.
I object. When was I ever optimistic?
No, you said this is something that can be avoided because of. I don't think it can be avoided because it is fueled, again, I remind you all, by these issues of security where I have no real handle, and they're very popular too.
Just wanted to bring in Lawrence, because globalization is known to, if you look at the academic studies, one of the downsides of it can be an increase in instability in developing countries. But this sort of language where you've got the President of the United States talking about trading partners as foes, we have a trade war which is having worrying ramifications, at least in terms of how people are feeling. What's the view from Africa? Are you serenely standing back and saying this is none of our concern, or does it worry you as much as it worries some of us?
I think it worries all of us. We are part of the global economy. However, I think Africa has evolved and moved on from the days of coup d'etats, of conflict, now to a more democratic, homogeneous society. What is at stake in Africa now is how do we industrialize? How do we go beyond aid? And that is why our president said Ghana beyond aid. It is for us to be able to now add value. And it's for which reason now, rather than before, where Africa was more fragmented, we think that time has come for us to be together in the face of this bullying, in the face of these tariffs, for us to have a common voice, for us to be able to also take the world on in some of these discriminatory tactics that is being bequeathed to Africa. So for Africa, we are learning from European Union. We want to also become a rule-based in trying to put together some of our rules that would help us to shape up and take over in the next generation to come. And that is what Africa is going for. I've always been challenging that, yes, the West look at Africa and is always talking about infrastructure. But what Africa needs today is manufacturing, is industrialization. Because if we are blessed with the kind of raw materials, take for Ghana, for instance, from gold to cocoa to bauxite, name it, we have it. However, over so many years now, we exported raw. How come, in fact, of the cocoa trade between Ivory Coast and Ghana, who are the leading producers of cocoa, which we use for chocolate, we only have 6% share or 3% share of the total trade. It's unbelievable. And we think time has come for us to change that unfairness, and that's why I like the view of that we should have a level playing field going forward.
I want to give credit to Rem for suggesting the video clip of Donald Trump there. And you also wanted to pitch in, didn't you?
Well, what I find interesting in this clip is not just that Donald Trump calls NATO treaty allies economic foes, which is, just let that sink in. It's what he says at the end. And it's great that you showed the long version of the clip. At the end, he says, so his line is, the EU is very tough. It's great. I actually compliment the EU for being tough on trade. I mean, if anything, the EU is a trade superpower, and that's a way in which we can make our influence felt across the world. And I support that. So it's not that he says that the EU is difficult. He says at the end, oh, and by the way, they're not paying their fair share of NATO defense expenditures, which is not an EU thing. I mean, go to the European Union, you will not find a desk anywhere that has sort of defense expenditures written on it. And this is precisely, I think, the dilemma that we in the European Union are confronting, is that we now have our most important security and economic partner linking everything together. And he does that deliberately to put us off guard as a negotiating tactic, but it undermines trust and confidence in other areas. So look at, for instance, the transcript of Donald Trump's meetings with Chancellor Merkel. The first time they met, Chancellor Merkel apparently had to say 11 times that they could not negotiate a bilateral trade agreement, because that's a competence that resides with the European Union. Okay, call that part of the learning experience. But on top of that, Donald Trump, in another visit, he says, well, Germany is bad because of the size of its trade surplus with the United States. Germany is bad because it's building Nord Stream 2, which is a benefit to Russia. And by the way, we have some LNG on sale, which might be able to replace that. And Germany is bad because it's not spending 2% of its GDP on defense. Now, from a European point of view, you know, those lines are not connected. We compartmentalize these different areas. We compartmentalize trade policy from energy policy from security policy, whereas Trump is mixing everything together. And that, I think, is creating some real difficulties in our ability on the EU side to adequately respond.
And to adequately respond, Ulrich.
I agree, of course, with everything Rem have said, and you have said also, Sandra, about the language. It is not helpful, but it's also our job, the international institutions and the individual players, actors in the WTO, to look beyond that language, because we can easily agree on a clip like this, but we need to look beyond this language. We also need to see that there's a superpower interest behind this. And if you go ask Congress if they think that Trump is too tough on China, you would get the answer, no, he's not tough enough on China. He's actually being attacked from the other side when it comes to China. So we also need to have a discussion about superpower interest. This is a little bit also what Rem said earlier. This is also geopolitics. And I actually agree with what was said earlier, that maybe China has not broken any rules in the WTO. That is not the problem. The problem is that the rules were made in the late 90s, early 90s. Some of them go back to when Bretton Woods was founded. And by then you could not imagine an economic superpower, one of the two biggest powers in the world, thriving from state capitalism, thriving from state-owned enterprises, subsidies, in a way that we simply did not foresee in a market economy. A hybrid between a socialist economy and a capitalist economy that was unimaginable. I was in Washington in the late 90s as a diplomat, and if there was one thing we were certain of, it was that growth would certainly bring democracy to China. And if growth didn't do the trick, then certainly the internet would. Now they've outgrown the rest of us, and they have more internet users than any of us, but we still have this hybrid rule in China. So we need to also look beyond some of the easy discussions that language is difficult and foes and so on. The reason why I'm pessimistic, and I have to bring some real pessimism to the fray here, is that if we can agree that the rules are outdated in the WTO, but we also agree that there is absolutely no alternative to multilateralism, the only way forward is reform. And that is, of course, difficult to see, but I'm glad to hear from Tim and Sandra that you're working on it. At the OECD, we're trying to help in e-commerce, in subsidies, and in other areas. But this is only the beginning. We are seeing a whole different trade community now than we did in the late 90s. I'm very happy that the WTO has started discussions on e-commerce. We cannot have a trading system without addressing e-commerce rules. That's simply not thinkable. But your next political boss, Sandra, has been talking about a carbon tariff. And again, this is what you would say, Tim, perhaps that is protectionism for an entirely legitimate reason. Why would we want to import goods from halfway around the world if we can produce them right here, and there's a big carbon emission associated with that transport from the other side of the world? That is a real discussion. That might be a legitimate carbon tariff, but it certainly also goes against the current rules of the trading system. So we're going to have lots of these problems come up in the multilateral trading system over the next 10 years. We've only seen the beginning of it. So the only solution really is to try addressing them, perhaps starting regionally, like the EU has done, plurilaterally, like the WTO is doing now with e-commerce. But it's difficult to be optimistic on these very big issues. And then one very last thing. It is true that there can be politically legitimate reasons for protectionism. But I have to say that the OECD policy advice on this is that only rarely is protectionism the best answer to that legitimate political objective. Often you would find the right political answer in social policies, in labor market policies, in educational policies, not in protectionism. What some of our political masters sometimes get wrong, now I'm being very diplomatic again, is that they're trying to protect jobs, but they're actually not trying to protect workers. If they were protecting workers, they would go through the labor market and not through protectionist policies.
I think the OECD just called the WTO a dinosaur, Tim. Are you going to sit there and take that?
I certainly didn't.
I'm just trying to cause trouble. We want to fight on the panel, don't we?
I think what was, there was a lot of truth to what was being said. Certainly, that there has been a degree of paralysis in the multilateral system for some time. But where I suppose I would differ is that I'm optimistic rather than pessimistic about what's been happening over recent years. And I would, we sort of frame what's been happening over the last 2 years, the criticisms of the WTO, the dispute settlement system. It's rather than dwelling on it, it's better to look at it as an opportunity to fix things. And that's the mindset that we have. In fact, the process of reform at the WTO started before President Trump came to power, which many people seem to forget, that the way we negotiated the trade facilitation agreement was revolutionary. This was in 2013 where we started to take more of a sectoral approach, where we started to take more a differentiated approach to the kind of commitments that developed and developing countries took on. We also then sectorally negotiated an agreement on agricultural export subsidies and on information technology. So there are some lessons out of all of this. And more recently, in the last few years, as Ulrich was saying, there has been a negotiation commenced on electronic commerce, but also similar discussions taking place on investment facilitations and measures for small and medium enterprises. What has generated all of this is that long before the current US administration came to power, many members of the WTO realised that the current modus operandi was not working. Unfortunately, it was proving impossible to get multilateral agreement involving all members across a whole range of different issues, embodied by the Doha round or the Uruguay round or where you had a whole big set of. So members have started to act more pragmatically, working on a sectoral basis. Very importantly, like-minded groups of countries have started. So these are the so-called plurilaterals. If you can't get agreement multilaterally because some countries are not ready or don't want to, we're not going to wait, which was the way of the past, until everyone can agree. We now have something like 78 countries, so that's more than half of the membership of the organisation, involving 90% of global trade, negotiating a new agreement on electronic commerce. We also, there are some very big contentious issues around development and the status of developing countries. Those, are sort of being discussed. But again, rather than having a big philosophical discussion about those things, if you look at what's been happening in the trade facilitation agreement, or if you see how the discussion is taking place in electronic commerce, you can see ways where potentially you can start to negotiate provisions to agreements in different ways for different countries, but you're doing it. You're doing it in a cooperative manner at the WTO, and your intention with all of this work is intensely multilateral in nature. It's saying we're starting there are 70 countries at the moment, but the idea is that eventually, when everyone else is ready to sign on, they can also participate in these areas. So all of these things have only happened over the last few years, and they are absolutely revolutionary in the way they are changing the dynamic in Geneva and how we try to move issues forward. It's extremely complicated, it's extremely difficult, especially in the current environment, but I am hopeful, and this is where my optimism comes, that there is that we are starting to set the constitution, so to speak, for the global trading system going into the 21st century.
Thank you, Tim. I think it was the chief executive of Western Union who said that it might even be a red herring regarding protectionism because everything was being digitised and people can trade in different ways. But I think that might have been a bit of an oversimplification. Mojmir, you're not going to escape. I think sitting here in Slovenia, as we are, I need to ask you just one question. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic?
On trade or generally?
I think this will be more philosophy with Mojmir. No, I think in terms of what everybody else has been saying here about the general mood of the direction of travel.
I think, I am a little bit more pessimistic, particularly now what Tim was saying, that seeing, now this going into developing into a kind of the trade arrangement for the 21st century, I would very much like that he's right and that it's really going that way. I don't think that I would be able to share this, particularly because there is growing these tensions which are really going beyond the trade. They are really, I think this discussion which was talked about the EU compatibilization, that you have on the trade policy very clean situation, I mean clean in a sense of responsibility. You have on the other side the issues which are the geopolitical, where you have the consensus issue to be discussed. So how to merge these two things for Europe will be extremely difficult. And here, I don't know, Guy, maybe you're escaping Brexit to bring into this picture of the.
Sorry, I don't use that word.
But I would bring it here in the context of the trade, because I think that will have significant implications on the EU, and then also on the relationship between the US and EU. And so maybe to provoke somebody to react on this, I think the UK, in case that it really comes out as a kind of this hard Brexit, what it shows, that's a perfect situation for Trump, also with respect to the trade policy towards the EU. Right?
Crumbs. We've got about 17 minutes to go. So at this point, I'm obliged to turn on this mic and see if anybody's got questions. I can ask more questions of the panel, and we can have people react to the Mojmir's provocation there, which in some ways I'd quite like them to. But I do feel we also have to open the floor to questions, and please put our panelists in awkward positions. After all, that would be much more entertaining. So if anybody would like to put our panelists in an awkward position or start a fight, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll let Mojmir start it. Oh, good.
Yes, thank you. Is it working? Okay, perfect. I hope I'm not putting anyone in an awkward position. Actually, I'm more interested in what they could say about the adequacy of free trade rules with the need and the desire and the concerns about having a more sustainable and economy, and the concerns about environmental issues, which is a good thing we are speaking about that, because we're in Slovenia and this is a country where they are really concerned about that. I'm a bit issue about sustainability would be used as an argument by some countries to say you are doing protectionism. When we speak, for example, about local production, could it be used as an argument to say, well, you are actually doing protectionism? Thank you.
I think it's a fair point, isn't it? And this has been perhaps one of the reasons why we've seen a popular backlash against globalization and against free trade, is because people do feel that it's been about exploitation as much as it's been about increasing standards of living. Would anybody like to respond to that? Looks like Ulrich does. He's got an itchy trigger finger.
I have a very personal experience with this. The very first job I was given in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or well, the second one back in the 90s, was that I was sent to this obscure committee in the WTO called the CTE, the Committee on Trade and Environment. But as it turned out, in the run-up to the Singapore conference, I think it was in 99, Sandra, or was it 98? This committee actually was the one who took the longest time in finishing a report and never finished the report. It even outlasted the Agricultural Committee, which was a first at the WTO. And this was exactly because at the time there was a lot of industrialized countries who thought that environment had become important, not least my own country at the time, Denmark, along with Sweden and others, said the WTO has to be more environmentally responsive. But then, of course, there were lots of countries who feared that this would be a pretext for protectionism. This was a discussion already back in the 19s. It was the equivalent of a discussion on trade and labor rights. Again, perhaps a legitimate reason to protect labors, but could it also be a shell or an alibi for protectionism? And I think we're going to see this again. I just touched upon it with the carbon tariff. That could be an entirely legitimate way of going about decreasing needs for transportation around the world, but certainly also, in essence, a protectionist measure. So I think we're going to see the revival of the dilemma between pursuing trade and climate objectives.
Rem.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. We've talked a little bit about the importance of language. What we sometimes do in panels like this is that we talk about free trade, and we say free trade is good, protectionism is bad. From my personal point of view, and my analysis has drawn me to that conclusion, it's not free trade per se, because free trade is accompanied by the risk of environmental degradation, which then allows producers to outcompete producers that do respect environmental rules. So what we need to talk about is rules-based trade. And rules-based trade, and this gets me to the European Union, is, I think, a very strong mechanism to ensure sustainable trade to really take hold. And I want to commend, again, the EU for taking a real leadership role in this. There is something that is called trade conditionality, which the European Parliament has imposed to sign off on mandates for the European Commission to start free trade agreements. That conditionality now applies to human rights violations, to weapons of mass destruction clauses. In other words, the European Parliament has said we're not going to sign off on a mandate if the country with which the European Commission wants to negotiate violates a number of these principles. I think the European Parliament will go down the route of also starting to impose certain environmental conditionalities. We already see this in some of the discussions between Macron and Bolsonaro, where Macron has said, look, we're not going to sign Mercosur if you continue to burn down the Amazon rainforest. Macron has been also particularly a European leader on this, where he said we're not going to entertain thoughts of negotiating a free trade agreement with a country that's not supporting of the COP21 Paris Climate Agreement. Now, it's an open question whether or sort of the proof of the pudding is in the eating when it applies to the United States. But as a general principle, and given the size of the European market and the interest third countries have in signing free trade agreements with the EU, that type of conditionality on sustainability and environmental protection, I think, is a way in which to continue to develop global trade norms in a direction that supports environmental protection.
Sandra, you've just had some praise.
Thank you. by the way, almost directly, because I was the director for sustainability and trade, and it was the massive file under Commissioner Malmström. I want to publicly praise her, because she was the one that trailblazed this into the trade policy of the EU, and I was a bit her soldier at the beginning, because even changing the chip of our colleagues in DG Trade was not very easy. So I want to allay the fears of our member of the audience. First of all, whenever the EU will do something, it will be WTO compatible. So may I say, without any doubt, anything that we will do on carbon will be WTO compatible. We will not produce, I would say, new experiments in WTO incompatibility. We are very much at the moment in trade policy listening to what, may I say, consumers and voters want. Not just consumers. You remember that for many years, especially thanks to the UK, we had this drive that, you know, the consumer was king. So, you know, it was good to increase, I would say, cheaper imports if at the end of the day consumers could benefit from greater choice, better prices. But today we are in a different type of consumerism. It's consumers are aware. So we can't. And may I take issue with one word that has been used here all the time? I have duly abstained. Is this phrase free trade? There's nothing that is free trade. It's all regulated trade. In Europe, nothing that we don't like will enter Europe. Witness our high SPS standards. So, you know, on the issues of environmental elements, we have many elements which are, I would say, binding, such as conflict minerals. We have a regulation whereby you can't be sourcing coltram from the artisanal miners in Africa, and this was a big issue because, you know, we knew what was behind it. So we as Europeans, we are trying to show the way of a more responsible approach. Now, I may say this is an old story from the discussions in Singapore in DDA, then in Doha. We had paragraph 31 of the Doha Declaration, which has three sub-paragraphs, single I, double I, and triple I. Triple I is the one we worked most. It's on the environmental goods issue. What is an environmental good? We tried to produce a list. We were very, very close to an agreement 2 years ago on December, I would say 2017, but then, you know, it didn't materialize, but I have hopes that that can be somehow resurrected. But on the standards, I want to be very reassuring to you. There is not only the essential elements, as we call them, that is human rights and all elements for which our bilateral agenda is absolutely, I would say, clear that you need to respect those essential elements. On the other hand, there are many issues that we include in our bilateral agenda which somehow are in a harmonious discussion with the partners agreed to, and they may be binding, they may become binding in time. We have lots of OECD guidelines for corporate social responsibility or responsible business conduct that we include in our agreements. What I want to say, though, on all these issues of values is that Europe should not go around the world patronizingly on this and should not be the sheriff of the world. We want multilateral institutions, so this is why the single E of that 31, paragraph 31, was very important. It was one where we were actually proposing to have parity between multilateral environmental agreements and the WTO agreement. Now, this is an area where we don't have time to go this morning, but this is the area of most friction in WTO. I do not deny. There is always this idea that WTO has a primacy on trade matters. And we as Europeans, we have always said, well, you know, it's not all trade. There are some ideas in these environmental conventions, and you can extend it, because we are very, very much looking into many conventions. So I would say that we do, in our bilateral agenda, include even ILO elements, conventions, and binding respect of that. for the multilateral. We really would like the rest of the world to help us on these values, because this is what people want. Whether they are in Accra, whether they are here, they all want to have decent lives, and they don't want to be producing like chickens in a pen and then, you know, not even being able to consume their salary because their health is rotten, because their environment is totally polluted. What sort of world is that? That is not the European ideal. So trust me, we are pushing values, and we are pushing them in a compatible way.
I do want you to know, nobody gets out of this room without answering at the door which paragraph of the Doha Agreement and which subsection, okay? We need to make sure you've been paying attention. Lawrence, I think we do need to hear from you specifically. African countries have been undoubtedly exploited over the years. Do you feel that you actually need protectionism in order to ensure that doesn't either repeat or continue?
I don't think we need protectionism at this point in time. What we do need, as has been said by Sandra, is a level playing field, and also a bit more of engagement. For instance, here I hear environmental and sustainable issues coming up. Previously, it used to be human rights, child labor, and then it keeps going on. We are at the tail end of the chain. So every time Africa is playing a catch-up, and that is a bit troubling and worrying. For instance, I preside over a bank that is supposed to promote exports. However, if you look at all the EC agreement that has been signed, vegetables, you hear tomorrow there is a ban. We have the nicest and the freshest of pineapple, of mangoes, yet we cannot, as we speak, penetrate the European market. When they come to Ghana, they eat it. But they use standards as a way of protection to get it into their country. And that brings inequality. And when goods and services do not move, soldiers move.
That is an extremely sobering thought. I know that Tim and Moimea haven't had a say yet. We've got 5 minutes. I just want to check if we do have any more questions from the floor, which Tim and Moimea could answer. Otherwise, I'll let them loose on this one. We're going to let you loose on this one. All right, Tim, off you go.
I'd just like to support some of what's been said. Certainly Rem and Sandra talking about rules-based trade rather than putting this moniker of free trade, because I think that's what this is all about. Is there is a system of rules or a set of rules that underpin the way we trade and what we can and can't do that we've all agreed on, and it does include a lot of flexibilities to allow for issues around sustainability to be pursued. All of the agreements have exceptions clauses that allow countries to take steps, provided they're in the least trade restrictive manner possible. And that's where you can run, there's a lot of, you run into grey areas, and this is where that discussion that Sandra was talking about, in the Doha discussions was relevant. But certainly the WTO doesn't shy away from any of these issues, and we are strongly supportive of the Sustainable Development Goals. Economic growth and open trade is fundamental to development and jobs and livelihoods, to the environment. In fact, the next big test for us multilaterally is to conclude the negotiations on fisheries subsidies. There's a deadline to conclude that negotiation by the end of the year, and that is directly linked to, I think it's SDG 14.6, or don't quote me on that, but another test for people.
I'm going to say more numbers, and really, we're going to be stationed at the door there. So,
but I think certainly I don't think we should shy away from these issues. We certainly haven't. We work very closely with other international organisations on issues like environment, labour, employment, and actually we note with a lot of interest and do a lot of analysis around what's going into various bilateral agreements on these subjects, because quite often what we see is what starts out sort of bilaterally or regionally sort of can build towards things on a global basis as well. So, you know, I think that it is a contentious area. Certainly not everyone shares the EU's point of view. I think there's a lot of countries that worry about the possibility of the sustainability issues being used to cloak protectionism. But I come back to, if we can agree on rules around all these sorts of issues together, then we are going a long way to addressing those kind of tensions.
Moimir, this is a country which prides itself on its sustainability. Indeed, this hotel does.
Well, I think here I would really very much support it what was said from the, let's say, the Commission side, this European approach, in a way, rule-based, but not, of course, free trade for the sake of the narrowly considered free trade. I think, of course, I cannot speak for my country, but I think that's definitely something.
You're the Slovenian on the panel. You can.
No. I mean, in this, I'm sure that that's are the things what we understand in Slovenia is as a kind of the development. Of course, I do hope that we will be able to address these things in the European Union, to come with this, how to complement these things, to come with one voice on these things which are more and more important. And here, I think a lot of expectation is also from this new Commission, even though I'm aware that it's not the Commission which is responsible for this, but the Member States.
Thank you to all our panelists. We are living in an interesting time. If you want to hear the latest on what's going on with Britain and the European Union, it's in another room somewhere. Sorry we didn't get round to it, Moimir. Just to wrap up, I think we've talked a lot about optimism and pessimism, tangentially at least, while we've been talking here this morning. And the title of this panel was about protectionism as a source of instability. Now, let's hope that it doesn't go badly, that we don't increase instability, that we do not see soldiers start to march, as Lawrence puts it. So from Moimir down the panel, just in one word, feeling optimistic or pessimistic?
I would like to be optimistic, but I am not.
I think that what is happening in the world stage is a short-term approach. In the long term, multilateralism will prevail, and the EU should show leadership in the world stage for rule-based things to happen.
I'm taking that as optimism.
Very optimistic.
Tilting towards pessimism, but more optimistic after this panel.
The more pessimistic we are right now, the more optimistic I am about the future. In terms of our ability to get our act together. I mean, there has to be a sense of urgency that we don't think that we are still living in the happy 1990s, where the rules that we've developed between the US and the Europeans apply to all and are respected and enforced. We really need to start to think differently about the future of trade.
Sandra.
Optimistic.
Hooray. And,
we'll never surrender.
And Tim, to finish us off, and don't forget your mic.
The eternal optimist.
Very good. I will just say one final thing.
The professional optimist.
I will just say one final thing. A pessimist is never disappointed. Thank you very much for joining us. We haven't solved the problems of the world, but at least we kicked them around a bit. Thank you very much.